"Ain't no use closing the barn door after the horses bolted." The words echoed in Earl Whitaker's fading consciousness as the fluorescent lights of County General's emergency room blazed overhead. 72 years of stubborn pride had led to this moment flat on his back, surrounded by a flurry of medical staff moving with practiced urgency. BP's dropping, 90 to 60, heart rate 110 and climbing. Earl could feel the cool rush of something entering his veins through the fourth they jabbed into his arm. The sensation reminded him of the chill of Montana's Blackfoot River, where he'd been fishing just 2 weeks ago, back when this nightmare began. "Mr. Whitaker, can you hear me? Stay with us, sir." A young doctor hovered above him, her face a mask of professional concern. What was her name, Thompson? Dr. Thompson? She'd introduced herself when the ambulance had arrived, but the fever had made everything foggy. Through the haze, Earl caught sight of Martha in the doorway, his wife of 45 years, clutching her worn leather purse against her chest like a shield. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her usually neat silver hair disheveled. The sight sent a pang of regret through him, sharper than the throbbing in his back. "We need to prep him for emergency surgery," Dr. Thompson was saying. "The infection has spread beyond the localized area." Earl wanted to tell them he was fine, that a man his age had weathered worse storms than this. The words wouldn't come. His throat felt as parched as summer soil during drought season. "There's something moving in there." Another voice, male this time, a young resident with a look of disbelief. "I've never seen anything like this outside of textbooks." Earl knew what they were seeing. He'd felt it for days, that unnatural movement beneath his skin, like something alive and hungry. At first, he'd convinced himself it was just muscle spasms. Then, when the pain became too sharp to ignore, he told himself it was just a bad infection, nothing a tough old Montana rancher couldn't handle. Earl managed to croak out, reaching a weathered hand toward his wife. She stepped forward, taking his hand in both of hers. Her touch was warm against his clammy skin. "I called Brian," she whispered, mentioning their son. "He's on his way from Billings. Brian, they are their boy. The doctor, the son who'd begged him to see a physician when Martha had mentioned the swelling on his back during their weekly phone call. The son Earl had stubbornly rebuffed with, "Doctors are for folks who can't take care of themselves." A sharp pain lanced through Earl's back, radiating outward from the site of the swelling. He gritted his teeth to keep from crying out, but a guttural groan escaped anyway. The movement beneath his skin intensified, as though whatever was in there knew its host was weakening. "We're seeing significant tissue degradation," Dr. Thompson said, examining the wound on his back, "and there appears to be a parasitic organism." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Earl had seen parasites before, in the jungle, in another lifetime. He treated boys younger than his grandson for tropical infections that turned strong men into hollow shells. But that was Vietnam. This was Montana. Things like this didn't happen here. "Surgery now," Dr. Thompson ordered. "We need to extract the organism and debride the infected tissue before sepsis sets in." As they prepared to move him, Earl caught Martha's eye one more time, her face lined with decades of Montana winters and summer spent side by side. Held no reproach, only fear and love in equal measure. "Should have listened to you, Marty," he whispered. "Save your strength, you old mule," she replied, her voice breaking. "You can apologize proper when you're better." The ceiling tiles began to blur as they wheeled him toward the operating room. Earl's mind drifted back to the fishing trip, to the cool morning air and the promise of rainbow trout, to the moment when he'd first felt the sting on his back and dismissed it as nothing more than a mosquito bite. If only he'd shown Martha when she'd asked. If only he'd called Brian when the pain started. If only he hadn't been so damn stubborn. As consciousness began to slip away, Earl's thoughts turned to his father, James Whitaker, who died at 60 from a heart attack he'd ignored the warning signs of. Whitaker men don't complain, he'd always said, now as the anesthesia took hold. Earl wondered if stubbornness was the real Whitaker family legacy. The last thing Earl heard before darkness claimed him was the surgeon's voice. My God, it's actually trying to burrow deeper. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you are watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The morning had broken crisp and clear over Blackfoot River 2 weeks earlier, the kind of Montana summer day that made Earl Whitaker grateful for retirement. The weathered aluminum boat cut a gentle wake through water that reflected the sky like polished glass. Earl's fishing rod bent with a promising tug. "Think I got a fighter here, Frank?" Earl called to his neighbor in the stern. Frank Miller, 68 and nearly as stubborn as Earl, looked up from his own line. "About time I was starting to think you forgot which end of the rod to hold." Earl chuckled. the sound rumbling deep in his chest. These Wednesday fishing trips with Frank had become sacred since Earl had hung up his work boots 5 years ago. The routine gave structure to days that might otherwise blur together: fishing on Wednesdays, tending his vegetable garden on Thursdays, helping Martha with the church bake sale on Fridays. "You know what my daddy used to say," Earl replied, reeling steadily. "Patient man catches the biggest fish." "Your daddy said a lot of things, most of them questionable." Frank shot back with a grin. The rainbow trout broke the surface in a spray of silver droplets, fighting the hook with admirable determination. Earl worked it closer to the boat, his weathered hands moving with practiced ease. Despite the arthritis that sometimes made his fingers ache on cold mornings, he could still land a fish better than men half his age. "That's a good 5-pounder, Frank observed, as Earl netted the trout. "Martha'll be pleased." Earl nodded, carefully removing the hook. Martha's trout almondine was worth getting up at dawn for. He placed the fish in the cooler and wiped his hands on his faded Montana State sweatshirt. "A gift from Brian 3 Christmases ago. You hear from that boy of yours lately?" Frank asked, as if reading Earl's thoughts. "Brian called Sunday, same as always." Earl's voice carried a note of pride he couldn't quite disguise. "Says the hospital's considering him for chief of internal medicine. Not bad for a kid from Clearwater Creek," Frank said. "Must have got his brains from Martha's side." Earl laughed, though the comment stirred something uncomfortable. Brian's medical career had always been a complicated subject, pride mixed with an unspoken tension that neither father nor son seemed able to address directly. "Hey, remember when we got back from Nahum?" Frank said, changing the subject. "You knew more about field medicine than half those college boys at the VA." Earl's smile faded slightly. The memory of Vietnam was never far beneath the surface, a dark undertow that could pull him under if he let his guard down. "Different kind of medicine," he said simply. Their conversation drifted to safer topics: the town council's debate over road repairs, Frank's new granddaughter, predictions for the coming winter. The morning passed in that easy rhythm of old friendship, punctuated by the occasional splash of a fish and the call of ospreys overhead. It was nearly noon when Earl felt it, a sharp sting between his shoulder blades, like a wasp finding its target. "Damn," he reached back, trying to swat whatever had bitten him. "What's got you jumping?" Frank asked, looking up from his tackle box. "Something got me, probably just a mosquito." Earl rubbed the spot, already forgetting about it. "That'll buff right out." The phrase was one of Earl's favorites, applied to everything from minor injuries to major setbacks. Martha often rolled her eyes when he said it, especially when he used it to dismiss something that clearly wouldn't buff out without proper attention. They just decided to head back to shore for lunch when they spotted the man on the riverbank, waving frantically. "Someone's in trouble," Frank said, already turning the boat towards shore. The stranger was a hiker, mid-30s, with an expensive-looking backpack and a makeshift bandage wrapped around his forearm. Blood had soaked through the fabric. Thank God, this chance said as their boat scraped against the rocky shore. "I took a bad fall about a mile back, cut myself on some rocks." Earl was out of the boat before Frank could cut the engine, moving with the efficiency of someone who'd triaged wounds under far worse circumstances than a peaceful Montana morning. "Let me see it." Earl's voice shifted into the authoritative tone he hadn't used since 1973. The hiker, sensing competence, extended his arm without question. "Name's David Carson," the man said, wincing as Earl unwrapped the makeshift bandage. "Was doing a solo hike. Stupid mistake on those rocks." The cut was deep but clean. Earl assessed it with a practiced eye, noting the absence of dirt or debris in the wound. "You cleaned this already?" "Did my best with water from the stream and some antiseptic wipes from my first aid kit," David explained. "I've been hiking all over Southeast Asia last month. South America before that, always carry supplies." Earl nodded approvingly. He reached into the small tackle box where he kept a basic first aid kit, a habit from his time as a combat medic that he'd never explained to Frank or anyone else. "This'll need stitches," Earl said, applying a proper pressure bandage. "We'll take you into town. You seem to know what you're doing," David observed as Earl worked. Earl just grunted. "Had some practice at them." Frank gave Earl a knowing look but said nothing. They rarely spoke about Vietnam to others. Those memories belonged to a brotherhood that civilians couldn't fully understand. As they helped David into the boat, Earl felt another sting on his back, sharper this time. He reached back absently, feeling the spot where he'd been bitten earlier. It felt warm to the touch, slightly raised, probably just an allergic reaction to whatever bug had found him tasty. "That'll buff right out," he muttered to himself. The trip back to the landing was quick, with Frank keeping the boat at a steady clip while Earl monitored David's wound. The cut had stopped bleeding, the pressure bandage doing its job. "You a doctor?" David asked as they approached the shore. Earl shook his head. "Just picked up a few things along the way." He didn't mention the medical textbooks hidden in the attic, untouched for decades. Didn't talk about the acceptance letter to medical school that had arrived a week before his draft notice. Some doors, once closed, were better left that way. They drove David to the small medical clinic in Clearwater Creek, where Nurse Jenkins, who'd known Earl since high school, raised an eyebrow at his competent field dressing, but said nothing. Earl and Frank waited until the doctor confirmed David would be fine, then headed home with their catch. By the time Earl walked through his front door, the spot on his back was forgotten. Martha greeted him with a kiss and examined his catch with approval. "Looks like we're having trout for dinner," she said, her gray eyes crinkling at the corners. "How was Frank?" "Same as always," Earl replied, washing his hands at the kitchen sink. "Caught half as many fish and told twice as many stories." Martha laughed, the sound still girlish despite her 70 years. "Go clean up, you smell like river and fish guts." In the bathroom, Earl peeled off his sweatshirt and caught sight of his back in the mirror. A small red bump had formed between his shoulder blades, angry against his sun-weathered skin. He twisted to get a better look, wincing slightly at the tenderness. "Just a bug bite," he told his reflection. "That'll buff right out." He didn't give it another thought as he showered and changed. By dinner, when the spot began to itch in earnest, Earl simply reached back and scratched it, unaware that beneath his skin, something had found a home, something that had traveled much farther than David Carson's hiking expeditions could explain. The antiseptic smell of the hospital burned Earl's nostrils, cutting through the fog of semi-consciousness. His mind drifted between present pain and fragmented memories, neither fully awake nor completely under. The beeping of monitors created a rhythm that matched the throbbing in his back. "I shouldn't be here," Earl thought. "A man ought to die in his feet, not flat on his back with tubes in his arms, somewhere beyond his closed eyelids." He could hear the murmur of medical staff, the squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum. The sounds transported him back to another hospital, another time the field hospital outside Da Nang, where the air smelled of blood and disinfectant and fear. "Earl, can you hear me?" Martha's voice anchored him to the present. Her hand found his, warm and solid. He tried to speak, but his throat felt lined with sandpaper. A straw touched his lips, and he sipped cool water gratefully. "Brian's on his way," Martha said. "Should be here in about an hour." Brian. The thought of his son sent conflicting emotions churning through Earl's chest. Pride and love tangled with something dark or shame, perhaps, or fear. The boy had been right all along, hadn't he? Earl should have listened. "Dad, just get it checked out," Brian had said on the phone last week. A persistent swelling like that isn't normal, especially if it's getting larger. Earl's response had been dismissive. "I'm fine as a fiddle. Just need to walk it off. Don't need to go run into some doctor who will just tell me I'm old and charge me $100 for the news flash." "You're being ridiculous," Brian had countered, his doctor's voice taking over. "At your age, any unusual symptoms should be evaluated. This isn't about being tough, it's about being smart." At my age, Earl had felt his temper flare. "I can still split more firewood before breakfast than you could all day." Boy, the argument had escalated from there, ending with Earl hanging up abruptly. Now, lying in a hospital bed with what the doctors were calling a severe parasitic infection, Earl realized how foolish his pride had been. A sharp pain lanced through his back, dragging him fully into the present. Earl bit back a groan, unwilling to show weakness even now. The movement beneath his skin had subsided since they'd given him medication, but he could still feel it. An alien presence that had no right to be there. Should have shown Martha when she first asked about it. 5 days after the fishing trip, the bump had grown to the size of a quarter, red and angry. Martha had noticed him wincing when he leaned against his chair at dinner. "What's wrong with your back?" she'd asked, setting down her fork. "Nothing," Earl had said automatically. "Just slept funny." But Martha, who could read him better than anyone after nearly half a century together, wasn't satisfied. "Let me see." Reluctantly, he'd lifted his shirt, twisting so she could examine the spot. Her sharp intake of breath told him that it looked worse than he'd thought. "Earl Whitaker, that is not nothing. That's infected. It's just a bug bite." Was I about up to him? He'd insisted. "Probably got it fishing with Frank." "It needs antibiotic ointment at the very least," Martha had said, already heading for the medicine cabinet. "And if it's not better by tomorrow, you're going to the clinic." Earl had submitted to the ointment, but had no intention of seeing a doctor. Doctors meant hospitals, and hospitals meant the memories. The smells, the sounds of young men crying out for their mothers, Lieutenant Sullivan bleeding out under Earl's hands despite everything he tried to do to save him. Not your fault. The thought drifted through Earl's mind in a voice that sounded suspiciously like his son's. You weren't a doctor, just a medic. You did everything you could. Earl squeezed his eyes tighter, trying to block out the memories. The pressure in his back pulsed in time with his quickening heartbeat. The next memory surfaced unbidden 3 days after Martha had discovered the bump. Earl in the bathroom, shirt off, examining the swelling that had now grown to the size of a $50. The skin around it had taken on a purplish hue, and for the first time, he'd felt something that made his blood run cold, a distinct sensation of movement beneath the skin. Just muscle spasms, he told himself aloud, reaching for the ibuprofen in the medicine cabinet, nothing to get worked up about. But deep down in the place where a combat medic's knowledge still lived, Earl had known it wasn't muscle spasms, wasn't a simple infection either. This was something else entirely. Still, he'd said nothing to Martha, had worn loose shirts to hide the growing swelling, had taken ibuprofen to control the pain and fever that began to creep in around the edges. Mr. Whitaker, a new voice pulled Earl back to the present. Dr. Thompson again, her face swimming into focus as he opened his eyes. We're preparing you for surgery now. The CT scan shows the extent of the infection, and we need to remove the parasitic organism before it causes more damage. Earl tried to nod, but even that small movement sent pain radiating from the site of the infection. Can you tell us how this might have happened? She asked. Have you traveled internationally recently? Been swimming in any lakes or ponds? Earl licked his dry lips. Just fishing, local, Blackfoot River. Each word was an effort. Dr. Curry, Thompson frowned, making notes on her tablet. This type of parasitic infection is unusual in Montana. We typically see it in patients who've traveled to tropical regions. The hiker, David Carson, something about South America and Southeast Asia. The memory floated just beyond Earl's grasp, fragmented by fever and pain medication. Helped a hiker, Earl managed, cut his arm. Did the hiker mention traveling abroad? Dr. Thompson asked, her interest sharpening. Earl nodded weakly, the effort exhausting him. That could explain it, she said, more to herself than to Earl. Some parasites can transfer from human to human under certain conditions. We'll need to try to contact this hiker. The room began to swim again, reality blurring with memory. Earl thought he could hear the thump of helicopter blades, the shouts of medics calling for plasma, for morphine, for a miracle that wouldn't come. I'm fine as a fiddle, Earl mumbled, the words slurring together. Just need to walk it off. Mr. Whitaker, I need you to stay with us. Dr. Thompson's voice sounded distant now. Your son, Dr. Whitaker, is on the line. He wants to speak with you before surgery. Through the haze, Earl heard Brian's voice from the phone the nurse held near his ear. His son's doctor voice, steady and professional, but with an undercurrent of fear that cut through Earl's fog. Dad, listen to me. You're going to be okay. They're going to remove the parasite and clean out the infection. I've consulted with the surgical team, and they know what they're doing. Earl wanted to apologize for the argument, for his stubbornness, for all the years of distance that had grown between them. But all he could manage was a whispered, Brian, I'll be there soon, his son promised. Just hang on. As they wheeled him toward surgery, Earl caught one last glimpse of Martha, her face lined with worry, but still beautiful to him. Still the girl he'd fallen in love with before Vietnam, before the nightmares, before a lifetime of keeping his pain buried deep. I should have told her everything, Earl thought as the anesthesia began to take hold about the war, about Sullivan, about medical school. The darkness claimed him and Earl. Whitaker surrendered to it, wondering if he'd ever get the chance to say all the things he should have said long ago. 1 week before his emergency hospitalization, Earl sat on the edge of his bed shirtless, examining the wound on his back using a hand mirror. What had started as a mosquito bite-sized bump now resembled a golf ball, the skin around it an angry constellation of red and purple. The pain had become a constant companion, sharp when he moved, dull and throbbing when he sat still. Damn nuisance, Earl muttered, setting down the mirror and reaching for the tube of antibiotic ointment on the nightstand. The medication had done nothing to reduce the swelling, but applying it gave him the illusion of doing something productive. From downstairs he could hear Martha talking on the phone. Her voice kept deliberately low. She was calling Brian again, no doubt. Earl grimaced. His son would insist on a doctor visit, and Martha would side with him. The two of them, allied in their concern, would be difficult to resist. Earl worked the ointment into the skin around the swelling, careful not to press too hard on the center where the tenderness was most acute. As he did, He felt it again, that unnatural movement beneath the surface, like something shifting. The sensation sent a chill up his spine that had nothing to do with the early morning air. The first time he'd felt it, 3 days ago, Earl had convinced himself it was his imagination. The second time, he'd blamed muscle spasms. Now, on the fifth occurrence, a memory surfaced from Vietnam, a young private with a similar swelling on his calf after wading through rice paddies. The diagnosis had been a parasitic infection, though Earl couldn't remember the specific type. The medics had removed something long and white that had burrowed into the man's flesh. Could it be something like that, Earl wondered? A cold weight settling in his stomach, he pushed the thought away. This was Montana, not Southeast Asia. The most dangerous thing in the Blackfoot River was the occasional snapping turtle. Still, as he pulled his shirt over his head, wincing as the fabric brushed against the tender area, Earl couldn't shake the growing fear that this was more serious than he wanted to admit. The smell of coffee and bacon drifted up from the kitchen, but for the first time in recent memory, Earl had no appetite. The fever that had started yesterday evening had left him feeling hollow and slightly nauseated. Martha looked up as he entered the kitchen, her practiced eye taking in his pallor and the slight stiffness in his movements. "You look like warmed over death," she said bluntly, setting a cup of coffee in front of him as he lowered himself carefully into a chair. "And don't tell me you're fine as a fiddle because I won't believe it for a second." Earl attempted a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just a bit under the weather, nothing serious. That thing on your back is getting worse, isn't it?" Martha's tone made it clear she already knew the answer. "Brian says—" "I don't need Brian or any other doctor telling me about a bug bite," Earl interrupted, more sharply than he'd intended. He softened his tone at Martha's hurt expression. "I'm sorry, Marty, I just don't want to fuss over nothing." Martha sat across from him, leaving her own breakfast untouched. "Earl Whitaker, I have watched you limp around this house for a week, wincing every time you sit back in a chair. I've seen you taking ibuprofen like they're candy, and I heard you in the bathroom at 3 this morning, running the shower because you couldn't sleep from the pain." She reached across the table and took his hand. "This isn't nothing." Earl looked down at their intertwined fingers, his large and weathered, her slender but equally marked by decades of hard work. The band of gold on her ring finger had worn thin over 45 years. "Your father was the same way," Martha continued softly, refused to see a doctor even when the signs were staring him in the face. The mention of his father sent Earl's mind spinning back 30 years. James Whitaker, stubborn as the Montana mountains, ignoring the chest pains that had plagued him for weeks. Heartburn, he'd insisted, popping antacids like they were peppermints. Until the morning, Earl had found him slumped over the tractor, eyes open but seeing nothing, the massive heart attack having taken him in minutes. "Dad was different," Earl said, the words hollow even to his own ears. "That was his heart. And this is an infection that's clearly getting worse," Martha countered. "I'm not asking you to fly to the Mayo Clinic, just drive into town and let Dr. Peterson take a look." Earl's jaw tightened. "Not today. I promised Frank I'd help him fix his irrigation pump." Martha's expression made it clear she didn't believe him, but she didn't press further. After 45 years, she knew when Earl had dug in his heels. Instead, by Matau, she rose and began clearing the breakfast dishes, her movements brisker than usual. Earl watched her, guilt gnawing at him alongside the pain in his back. He knew she was right, knew this was more than a simple infection, but hospitals' doctors in general brought back too many memories of Vietnam, of the field hospital where he'd worked feverishly to save boys younger than his own son was now. The telephone rang, interrupting his thoughts. Martha answered it, her expression softening as she listened. "Yes, he's right here," she said, holding out the receiver to Earl. "It's Brian." Earl took the phone reluctantly. "Morning, son." "Dad." Brian's voice carried the dual tones of professional concern and filial worry. "Mom says that swelling on your back is getting worse." "Your mother worries too much," Earl replied automatically. "It's just a bug bite that got infected. Nothing to call the National Guard about. An infected wound that's not responding to topical antibiotics after a week is something to take seriously," Brian said, his doctor voice taking over, "especially at your age." There it was again, that reference to his age, as if turning 70 meant he was suddenly made of glass. Earl felt his temper rising. "I was patching up boys with shrapnel wounds when you were still in diapers," he said. "I think I can handle a bug bite. This isn't about your experience as a medic in Vietnam." "Dad," Brian's frustration was evident even through the phone line. "This is about being smart about your health. If it's a parasite, Earl interrupted. "Where'd you get that idea?" A pause on the line. "Mom mentioned you said it felt like something was moving." Earl shot Martha a betrayed look. She met his gaze steadily, unapologetic. Just muscle spasms. Earl insisted. Dad, listen to me. Brian's voice took on an urgency that gave Earl pause. If this is a parasitic infection, it could become serious very quickly. Some parasites can migrate through tissue, even into organs or the bloodstream. The memory surfaced again, the private in Vietnam, the white worm-like creature being extracted from his leg. The doctor explaining how the parasite had nearly reached a major blood vessel. I appreciate the concern, Earl said, his voice gruff to hide the fear that had begun to gnaw at him. But I'm fine. At least let me talk you through some symptoms to watch for, Brian persisted. Fever, increased pain, discoloration, spreading from the wound site. Earl remained silent, unwilling to admit he'd experienced all three. Dad, please. Brian's voice had lost its professional edge, revealing the worried son beneath. If not for yourself, then for Mom, and for me. The naked concern in his son's voice cut deeper than Earl expected. He looked at Martha, who was pretending not to listen while washing dishes, her back rigid with worry. I'll think about it, Earl finally conceded. Maybe day after tomorrow. Promise me, Brian pressed. I said, I'll think about it, Earl repeated, his tone making it clear the conversation was over. Give my love to Andrea and the kids. He hung up before Brian could respond. Guilt and irritation wrestling for dominance. Martha turned from the sink, drying her hands on a dish towel. He's worried about you, she said simply. We both are. Earl nodded, unable to meet her gaze. I know, that night as Earl lay awake, the pain in his back, a pulsing reminder of his stubbornness. He thought of his father again. James Whitaker had died as he had lived on his own terms without doctors or hospitals. At the time, Earl had admired his father's stubborn independence. Now, with Martha sleeping fitfully beside him, and the fever making his thoughts hazy, he wondered if it had actually been fear disguised as strength. You're not like him, Martha had said once, early in their marriage. You help people. You saved lives in that war. Not all of them, Earl thought. The face of Lieutenant Mike Sullivan floating in his mind's eye, not the ones who mattered most. As dawn broke over the Montana landscape, Earl finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, dreaming of white creatures burrowing beneath his skin, reaching for his heart just as surely as his father's disease had reached for his. 3 days before Earl would finally be rushed to County General, the July heat pressed down on the Whitaker farmhouse like a physical weight. Earl sat on the porch swing, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the relative coolness of the morning. The fever had spiked during the night, leaving him lightheaded and achy. Martha appeared in the doorway, a glass of iced tea in one hand and a thermometer in the other. You're not fooling anyone, you say. You know, she said, handing him the glass. You look like death warmed over. Earl took a sip of the tea, grateful for the cool liquid against his parched throat. Just the heat. It's supposed to hit 95 today. It's 72 degrees right now, Martha replied, holding out the thermometer. Open up. Earl considered refusing, but the determined set of Martha's jaw told him this was one battle he wouldn't win. He allowed her to slip the digital thermometer under his tongue, sitting in sullen silence until it beeped. Martha's frown deepened as she read the display. 101.4. Earl, this has gone far enough. We're going to the clinic today. Back in my day, we didn't run to doctors for every little fever, Earl grumbled, but the protest lacked his usual conviction. The truth was he felt worse than he was willing to admit. The site on his back now throbbed constantly, and twice this morning he'd felt that disturbing movement beneath his skin. Your day is today, and today you're seeing a doctor, Martha insisted, her voice leaving no room for argument. I'm calling Brian to let him know. As she went inside to make the call, Earl leaned his head back against the swing, closing his eyes against the too bright morning light. His mind drifted, the fever blurring the lines between past and present. Da Nang, 1971. The field hospital never truly slept, even at 3 in the morning. The wounded arrived with monotonous regularity, boys with shrapnel wounds, bullet holes, infections festering in the humid heat. Corporal Earl Whitaker, 21 and already aged beyond his years, moved between the cots with practiced efficiency. Medic, we need a medic over here. The shout came from the far end of the tent, where the new arrivals were being triaged. Earl grabbed his kit and hurried over. Lieutenant Mike Sullivan lay on a stretcher, face gray beneath the jungle grime, a makeshift bandage soaked through with blood wrapped around his thigh. Jesus, Mike, Earl breathed. recognizing his friend from basic training. What happened? Stepped in the wrong place, Ben Messiah Sullivan managed through gritted teeth. They say it's bad. Whitaker, Earl cut away the bandage, assessing the wound with the clinical detachment he'd developed over months in country. The shrapnel had torn through muscle and nicked the femoral artery. Sullivan was right, it was bad. You'll be dancing with the nurses in no time, Earl lied, applying a fresh pressure bandage and yelling for plasma. Just hang in there, Sully. And I will be, Earl said, checking Sullivan's pulse. Too fast, too thready. After this war, I'm going straight to medical school. Already got my acceptance letter. Sullivan's eyes were starting to glaze over. You'll make a good one. Better bedside manner than these butchers. The surgeon arrived then, taking one look at Sullivan, embarking orders for immediate surgery. As they wheeled his friend away, Earl caught Sullivan's hand. See you on the other side of this, he promised. But by morning, Lieutenant Mike Sullivan was dead, another name for the growing list of young men Earl couldn't save. Earl. Martha's voice pulled him back to the present. She stood before him, phone in hand, concern etched across her features. You were 1,000,000 miles away, she said softly. Or maybe 50 years. Earl nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The memories of Vietnam had been surfacing more frequently since the infection began, as if the fever had weakened the mental walls he'd built to contain them. Brian wants to talk to you, Martha said. Holding out the phone, Earl took it reluctantly. I'm fine, Sua. Your mother is making a mountain out of a molehill. In his office, 40 miles away, Brian Whitaker pinched the bridge of his nose, trying to control his frustration. The stubbornness that had kept his father alive in Vietnam was now the very thing endangering him. Dad, a fever of 1-on-1 coupled with an infected wound that's been present for over a week isn't a molehill, Brian said, keeping his voice calm and professional. I've consulted with an infectious disease specialist about your symptoms, and she's concerned it could be a parasitic infection. You told some straighter about my private business. Earl's indignation came through clearly despite the phone line. I didn't use your name, Brian replied patiently, but the symptoms you're describing, the movement sensation, the progressive swelling, the fever there are consistent with certain parasitic infections. Earl remained silent, the mention of parasites touching on his own unvoiced fears. Dad, please, Brian continued. Go to the clinic today. If it is a parasite, the sooner it's treated, the better. Earl looked at Martha, who stood watching him with arms crossed, her expression a mixture of worry and determination. The pain in his back pulsed in time with his heartbeat. I'll think about it, he finally said. That's what you said 2 days ago, Brian pointed out. Mom says you can barely sit in a chair without wincing, he said. Earl's temper flared. Your mother talks too much. She loves you too much, Brian corrected. We both do. The simple statement caught Earl off guard, momentarily diffusing his anger. He sighed, the sound heavy with more than just physical discomfort. I'll go tomorrow, he conceded. Got to help Frank with his tractor this afternoon. It was a lie, and for Martha's expression, she knew it. But Brian, perhaps sensing he'd gotten as much of a concession as he was going to get, accepted it. First thing tomorrow, he stressed. Promise me. First thing, Earl agreed. The words tasting like surrender. After hanging up, Earl handed the phone back to Martha, avoiding her gaze. There's nothing wrong with Frank's tractor, she said quietly. I know, Martha sighed, sitting beside him on the swing. What are you so afraid of, Earl? It's just a doctor's visit. Earl didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. How could he explain that hospitals reminded him of Sullivan, of all the boys he couldn't save? That doctors in their white coats brought back the memory of the medical school acceptance letter he'd burned after returning from Vietnam, too haunted by his failures to believe he deserved to heal others. Just don't like being fussed over, he finally said. The answer so inadequate, it was almost laughable. Martha didn't press. After 45 years, she knew there were parts of Earl that remained locked away. Trauma from Vietnam he'd never fully shared. Instead, she took his hand, her fingers cool against his fever-warm skin. I'm going to get you some more iced tea and some Tylenol, she said. Rising from the swing, try to rest. As Martha went inside, Earl closed his eyes again. The fever making the world swim around him. The pain in his back had intensified, and now it felt as though whatever was beneath his skin was moving with greater purpose, tunneling deeper. Earl's thoughts drifted to his father again, to James Whitaker's stubborn refusal to acknowledge his heart condition until it was too late. "A man stands on his own 2 feet," James had always said. "Doesn't go crying to doctors over every little thing." Those words had shaped Earl, formed the foundation of his identity as a man who could endure, who didn't complain, who carried his burden silently. But now, as though with fever clouding his thoughts and pain radiating through his body, Earl wondered if his father's stoicism had been wisdom or foolishness. "Back in my day, men didn't complain," Earl murmured to himself, the familiar phrase providing little comfort as the movement beneath his skin continued its relentless progress. Inside the house, Martha picked up the phone again, her mind made up. This had gone on long enough. Stubbornness be damned, she wasn't going to watch her husband following his father's footsteps all the way to an early grave. She dialed Brian's number again, her voice steady when he answered. "Your father's worse than he's letting on," she said without preamble. "I need you to come home today." 2 days before Earl would be rushed to the emergency room, Martha Whitaker stood in the dusty attic of their farmhouse. A cardboard box opened before her. She had come up here looking for Earl's old military records, something Brian had asked for over the phone, saying they might contain information about any tropical diseases Earl had been exposed to in Vietnam. Instead, she had found something else in Garlow. The box, labeled simply Earl School, contained items she'd never seen in their 45 years of marriage. On top lay a thick envelope with a university seal, the paper yellowed with age. Martha carefully opened it and pulled out a letter dated March 15, 1971. "Dear Mr. Whitaker," it began, "we are pleased to inform you of your acceptance to the University of Montana School of Medicine." Martha sank slowly onto an old trunk, the letter trembling in her hands. Earl had been accepted to medical school. He had never mentioned applying, never spoken of wanting to be a doctor. Yet here was evidence that not only had he applied, but he had been accepted. Beneath the acceptance letter lay textbooks, Gray's Anatomy, Principles of Internal Medicine, Parasitology, and Tropical Diseases. The books were well worn, their margins filled with neat, precise notes in Earl's handwriting. Martha flippered through the parasitology textbook, stopping at a page where Earl had underlined a section about subcutaneous parasitic infections. The margin note read, "Sullivan's similar symptoms." The final item in the box was a journal bound in worn leather. Martha hesitated, her hand hovering over it. This felt like an invasion of privacy, a glimpse into a part of Earl's life he had deliberately kept hidden. But her concern for his health outweighed her reluctance. The journal's first entry was dated September 1970, before Earl had been deployed to Vietnam. "Finished my pre-med requirements today. Dr. Hoffman says my application to medical school is strong. Says the world needs doctors who understand what it means to work with your hands. Dad doesn't understand why I'd want to leave the ranch for book learning, but Mom's proud. If I get in, I'll be the first Whitaker to become a doctor." Martha turned the pages, reading entries that tracked Earl's hopes for medical school, his draft notice, his training as a combat medic. The handwriting changed after his deployment grew tighter, more controlled, as if Earl was holding himself together through sheer force of will. The entry dated April 18, 1971, made Martha catch her breath. "Sullivan died this morning. The shrapnel nicked his femoral artery. I tried everything I knew, everything they taught us, but it wasn't enough. The surgeon says nothing would have saved him, but if I'd recognized the arterial bleeding sooner, maybe I got the acceptance letter from medical school yesterday. Feels like a cruel joke now. What right do I have to be a doctor when I couldn't even save my friend?" The final entry was dated July 2, 1973, shortly after Earl had returned home from Vietnam. "Burn the acceptance letter today. Can't walk into a hospital without hearing the choppers, without smelling the blood. Dad says a man knows his limitations, says there's no shame in working the land instead of chasing dreams that died in the jungle. He's right. Some wounds don't heal. Some failures define you. Better to accept that than pretend otherwise." Martha closed the journal, tears blurring her vision all these years, and she'd never known. Earl had dreamed of becoming a doctor, had actually been accepted into medical school, and had abandoned that dream because of a trauma and guilt he'd never shared with her. She remembered now how they'd met at a welcome home dance for returning veterans. Earl had been quiet, reserved compared to the other young men. When she'd asked what he planned to do now that he was home, he'd simply said, "Work the ranch with my father. That's all I ever wanted." She had believed him. Martha carefully repacked the box, her mind racing. This explains so much: Earl's aversion to hospitals, his dismissal of doctors, his insistence on handling injuries and illnesses himself. It wasn't just stubbornness or traditional masculine stoicism, It was a deliberate turning away from a path that had become associated with his greatest perceived failure. The sound of the screen door slamming downstairs pulled Martha from her thoughts. Earl was back from his morning walk, a ritual he had maintained despite his worsening condition, though his walks had grown shorter and slower with each passing day. Martha took the journal and made her way downstairs, finding Earl in the kitchen, leaning heavily against the counter as he poured himself a glass of water. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice unnaturally tight. "In the attic. I was looking for your military records." Like Brian asked, Martha set the journal on the kitchen table between them. "Earl, why didn't you ever tell me you wanted to be a doctor?" Earl looked away, his jaw working. For a moment, Martha thought he might refuse to answer, might retreat into the silence that had sheltered his pain for decades. "It was a young man's dream," he finally said. "Didn't survive the war." "Because of Lieutenant Sullivan?" Martha asked gently. Earl's head snapped up, surprise and something like fear in his eyes. "You read it all, enough to understand." Martha moved closer, careful not to crowd him. "Earl, what happened to your friend wasn't your fault." "I was the medic," Earl said, the words carrying the weight of a confession long withheld. "I was supposed to keep him alive until we could get him to the real doctors. I failed." "You were barely 21 years old, with field training and combat conditions," Martha countersured. "The journal said the surgeon told you nothing would have saved him. Surgeons say that to make the medics feel better." Earl's voice was bitter. "I knew I hit the artery. I should have recognized it sooner." Martha reached out, taking his fever-warm hand in hers. "So you punished yourself by giving up your dream of becoming a doctor?" It wasn't a question, but Earl nodded anyway. The simple movement seeming to cost him. "Couldn't walk into a hospital without hearing the choppers," he admitted, without seeing their faces. "Sullivan, Jenkins, Rodriguez, all of them, looking at me to save them." "Oh, Earl." Martha's heart ached for the young man who had carried this burden alone for so long. "Why didn't you tell me?" "What was there to tell?" Earl asked, his voice rough. "That I wasn't strong enough, that I let them die. And then I let that failure define the rest of my life." He gestured to the journal. "Those are the words of a coward, Martha." "No," Martha said firmly. "Those are the words of a young man traumatized by war, of someone who cared so deeply that he couldn't bear the weight of not being able to save everyone." Earl shook his head, unconvinced, but Martha pressed on. "You've been caring for people your whole life, Earl. The way you knew exactly what to do when the Henderson boy broke his arm at the creek. How you talked Mabel Williams through her husband's heart attack until the ambulance arrived, even last week, with that hiker. And look where that got me," Earl interrupted, gesturing to his back. "Some parasite eating me alive because I thought I knew better than to seek proper medical help." The admission that he recognized the seriousness of his condition startled Martha. It was the first time Earl had acknowledged that this was more than just a bug bite. "Then let's get you proper medical help now," she urged. "Brian's on his way. He'll be here in a few hours." Earl was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the journal that held the evidence of his abandoned dreams. Finally he nodded. "Some wounds don't heal, Martha," he said quietly, echoing the words from his final journal entry. "Not ever, maybe not completely." Martha agreed, moving to stand beside him, her arm slipping around his waist. "But they can get better with proper care. They don't have to define the rest of your life." Earl leaned into her, allowing her to support some of his weight, another silent admission of how ill he truly felt. "I should have told you," he murmured. "About medical school, about Sullivan." "Yes, you should have," Martha said simply. "But we're talking about it now. Better late than never." She guided him toward the living room. "Come sit down, I'll get you some Tylenol, and then you can tell me more about this dream of yours while we wait for Brian." As Earl settled carefully onto the couch, Martha thought she saw something shift in his expression, a loosening of a tension so long held it had become part of his features. The infection was still there, still threatening, but perhaps another kind of healing had begun. The night before, Earl would be rushed to County General, unfolded with the slow-motion quality of a nightmare. Sunset painted the Montana sky in shades of crimson and gold, filtering through the curtains of the Whitaker farmhouse and casting long shadows across the living room where Earl lay on the couch, drifting in and out of consciousness. Brian had arrived that afternoon, his doctor's bag in hand and concern etched into features that resembled Earl's own. His initial examination of his father had been conducted with professional detachment, but Martha had seen the fear in her son's eyes when he'd looked at the swelling on Earl's back. "We need to get him to a hospital," Brian had said, his voice low as he spoke to Martha in the kitchen. "This is beyond what I can handle here. The infection is spreading, and there's definitely something moving in there." "He'll fight going," Martha had replied, glancing toward the living room where Earl had finally fallen into a fitful sleep. "He doesn't have a choice anymore," Brian had said firmly. "His fever's 103 and that sight on his back." He trailed off, shaking his head. "I've called ahead to County General. They're expecting us first thing in the morning." Now, as evening deepened into night, Martha sat in the armchair beside the couch watching Earl's labored breathing. His face was flushed with fever, his silver hair dark with sweat. Even in sleep, pain etched lines around his mouth and eyes. "I should have pushed harder," Martha whispered to herself. "Should have made him go to the doctor days ago." "Not your fault," Brian said from the doorway, startling her. He crossed the room and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You know how stubborn he is. Gets it from Grandpa." Martha nodded, reaching up to cover her son's hand with her own. "I found something today," she said quietly in the attic. "Did you know your father was accepted to medical school before Vietnam?" Brian's surprise was evident. "Dad, no. He never said anything. He never told anyone, apparently." Martha glanced at Earl, making sure he was still asleep. "He gave it up after the war, after losing a friend he couldn't save." Understanding dawned in Brian's eyes. "That explains a lot. The way he reacted when I decided to go to medical school, I always thought he was disappointed. I didn't want to take over the ranch. I think he was proud," Martha said. "And afraid for you at the same time. Afraid you'd face the same kind of heartbreak he did." Brian absorbed this new information in silence, his gaze shifting to his father. The revelation cast Earl's lifelong resistance to medical care in a new light, not merely stubbornness, but a complex tangle of guilt, trauma, and grief. "We should try to get some rest," Brian finally said. "Tomorrow will be a long day. I'll take the first watch. Make sure his fever doesn't spike any higher." Martha nodded, too exhausted to argue. She'd been up since dawn, her worry for Earl draining her more effectively than any physical labor. She kissed Earl's forehead gently, alarmed at the heat radiating from his skin, then retreated to their bedroom, leaving the door open to hear if she was needed. Brian settled into the armchair his mother had vacated, his doctor's eyes clinically assessing his father's condition, while his heart ached with the new knowledge of Earl's abandoned dreams. He thought of all the times his father had patched up his childhood scrapes and breaks with a competence that had seemed natural but now revealed itself as formal training. Around midnight, Earl's fever spiked dramatically. He began to thrash on the couch, his eyes open but unseeing, lost in delirium. "Gotta get pressure on it," Earl muttered, his hands reaching for something only he could see. "Sullivan's bleeding out, need plasma." "Where's the damn plasma?" Brian grabbed his father's wrist gently but firmly. "Dad, it's Brian. Brian, you're home in Montana. You're safe." Earl's eyes focused briefly on his son's face, a moment of clarity breaking through the fever. "Brian, when did you get here?" "This afternoon, Dad. Remember I examined your back?" Earl nodded, then winced as pain shot through him. "Something's in there," he whispered, real fear breaking through his usual stoicism. "I can feel it moving." "I know," Brian said, maintaining his professional calm despite the alarm bells ringing in his head. "We're going to take care of it tomorrow at the hospital." "Hospital," Earl repeated, the word triggering another wave of distress. "No hospitals, the smell, the sounds." "It's different now, Dad," Brian assured him, wringing out a cool cloth and placing it on his father's forehead. "Modern hospitals aren't like the field hospitals in Vietnam." Earl didn't seem to hear him, slipping back into fever dreams. "The hiker," he mumbled, his arm, should have worn gloves. "Rookie mistake," Brian frowned, trying to make sense of his father's disjointed words. Martha had mentioned Earl helping an injured hiker at the lake, but she hadn't known details. Could that be the source of the infection? Around 2 a.m., Martha appeared in the doorway, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. "How is he?" she asked. Though Earl's condition was evident in his restless movements and incoherent murmuring. "The fever's getting worse," Brian said, his professional demeanor slipping to reveal his worry. "I've given him more Tylenol, but it's not bringing it down enough. We might need to take him in tonight instead of waiting for morning." Martha nodded, moving to sit on the edge of the couch beside Earl. She took his hand, alarmed at how hot and dry his skin felt. "Earl, can you hear me?" Earl's eyes fluttered open, struggling to focus on Martha's face. "Marty, His voice was a hoarse whisper. "Something's wrong." "I know, love, odd," Martha said, squeezing his hand. "Brian's here. We're going to get your help." Earl's free hand moved restlessly to his back. "It's moving. Can feel it. Trying to get out." Martha exchanged a worried glance with Brian, who moved to a yam in Earl's back again. As he helped his father lean forward, the light caught something that made Brian's blood run cold. "Mom," he said quietly, his professional calm deserting him. "I need you to look at this." Martha moved to where she could see Earl's back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a gasp. The swelling had developed a small rupture at its center, and protruding from it was something white and segmented, unmistakably organic. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Is that a parasite?" Brian confirmed, his voice tight. "We need to call an ambulance." Now Martha was already moving for the phone when Earl let out a guttural cry of pain that stopped her in her tracks. She turned to see him arching his back, face contorted in agony. "It's moving," he gasped. "Jesus Christ, it's trying to get out." Brian was beside his father in an instant, supporting him as Earl writhed in pain. "Easy, Dad. Try not to move." The protrusion from Earl's back had extended further, revealing what was unmistakably the head of a parasitic worm. Its blind, seeking movements both fascinating and horrifying. "Call 911, Brian ordered Martha, his doctor's training taking over despite the surreal horror of watching a parasite emerge from his father's body. "Tell them we have a severe parasitic infection with the organism beginning to emerge. Tell them to be prepared for extraction and potential sepsis." Martha, white-faced but steady, made the call. Her voice only trembled slightly as she relayed Brian's instructions to the dispatcher. Earl had fallen back against the couch, exhausted by the pain, his breathing shallow and rapid. His eyes, when they opened, held a terrible clarity. "Always knew something would come back from that war to kill me," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "Just didn't expect to take 50 years. "This isn't from Vietnam, Dad," Brian said, preparing a makeshift containment for the emerging parasite with supplies from his medical bag. "This is recent. You mentioned a hiker." Earl nodded weakly. "At the lake, cut his arm. Said he'd been hiking in South America, Southeast Asia." The pieces clicked into place for Brian. "The parasite must have transferred from him to you through the open wound on his arm. If he was infected and you had a small cut or abrasion." "Rookie mistake," Earl murmured again. "Should have worn gloves. First rule of field medicine." Outside, the wail of an ambulance siren cut through the night, growing steadily louder as it approached the isolated farmhouse. Martha moved to the door, ready to guide the paramedics in. Earl's hands shot out, gripping Brian's arm with surprising strength. "Your mother," he said urgently. "The journal she showed you." Brian nodded. "She told me about medical school, about what happened in Vietnam." Relief washed over Earl's face. "Good. Needed you to know. Not because I was disappointed. Never that." "I know, Dad," Brian said, his professional composure cracking to reveal the worried son beneath. "We'll talk about it more when you're better." Earl's grip tightened. "If I don't make it, you will," Brian interrupted firmly. "I'm not losing you to a damn worm. Dad, not after everything you've survived." A ghost of Earl's usual stubbornness crossed his face. "Always were a headstrong kid." The ambulance pulled into the driveway, lights painting the living room, and alternating red and white. As the paramedics rushed in with their equipment, Earl looked at his son one last time before they took over. "Proud of you, Doc," he whispered. "Always have been." Then the paramedics were there, their professional efficiency pushing Brian temporarily aside as they assessed Earl and prepared him for transport. Brian stepped back, watching as they confirmed his findings with looks of professional fascination and horror. "Never seen anything like this outside of textbooks," one of them murmured, echoing what the resident would say later in the emergency room. As they loaded Earl onto the stretcher, Martha appeared at Brian's side, her face set with determination despite her fear. "We're going to get through this," she said, taking his hand. "Your father's too stubborn to let some worm get the better of him." Brian nodded, hoping she was right, trying not to think about sepsis rates and mortality statistics for elderly patients with advanced parasitic infections. Instead, he focused on what he now knew about his father, that Earl Whitaker had once dreamed of being a doctor, had saved lives in the most horrific conditions imaginable, and had carried the weight of those he couldn't save for 50 years. "Let's go," he said, guiding his mother toward the door. Dad's waited long enough for proper medical care. The harsh fluorescent lights of County General's surgical waiting room cast Martha and Brian in a sickly pallor as they sat side by side waiting for news. It had been 3 hours since Earl had been rushed into emergency surgery, the parasite in his back actively emerging when they arrived at the hospital. Family of Earl Whitaker. Martha and Brian looked up simultaneously as Dr. Sarah Thompson approached, still dressed in surgical scrubs. Her expression was carefully neutral, but Brian, with a doctor's trained eye, detected the slight relaxation around her eyes that suggested good news. "How is he?" Martha asked, rising to her feet. "Stable," Dr. Thompson replied. "We successfully removed the parasite and debrided the infected tissue. He's receiving intravenous antibiotics for the infection, which was substantial but contained. Thankfully, we got to it before sepsis could develop." Brian exhaled slowly, relief washing over him. "What kind of parasite was it?" "Anathostoma spinagorum," Dr. Thompson said, her professional demeanor giving way to genuine fascination. "It's extraordinarily rare in North America, typically found in Southeast Asia and parts of South America, primarily transmitted through undercooked fish or water, contaminated with infected copepods." "The hiker," Brian said. "The piece is falling into place. Dad mentioned helping an injured hiker who'd been traveling in those regions." Thompson nodded. "That would explain it. If this hiker was infected and your father had direct contact with his blood or tissue while having an open wound himself, even a microscopic one, the parasite could have transferred hosts." "Is he going to be okay?" Martha asked, cutting through the medical discussion to the question that mattered most. "Barring complications, yes," Thompson assured her. "The parasite was fully removed, along with the surrounding infected tissue. We'll keep him for observation for several days to ensure the antibiotics are effective, and to monitor for any signs of secondary infection. When can we see him?" "HTM." Martha's voice betrayed her exhaustion, but her eyes were clear and determined. "He's in recovery now. Once he's moved to the ICU, you can see him briefly. He's heavily sedated, so don't expect much responsiveness." Martha nodded, sinking back into her chair as Dr. Thompson excused herself to check on another patient. Brian sat beside his mother, taking her hand in his. "He's going to be all right, Mom," he said softly. "Dad's tougher than any parasite." Martha managed a weak smile. "All these years I thought I knew everything about your father. Then I find out he wanted to be a doctor, that he's been carrying this guilt about Vietnam all this time." She shook her head. "Makes me wonder what else I don't know." "I think he's wondering the same thing," Brian replied. "When he saw that journal in your hands, it was like watching a dam break, all those carefully constructed walls coming down at once." They sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. The waiting room slowly emptied as other families received news of their loved ones and departed, leaving Martha and Brian alone with the soft hum of the vending machines and the occasional squeak of nurses' shoes on the polished floor. "Dr. Whitaker," a nurse appeared at the doorway. "Your father is being moved to ICU now. You can see him for a few minutes if you'd like." Brian helped Martha to her feet, supporting her as they followed the nurse through the labyrinthine corridors to the intensive care unit. Earl lay in a bed surrounded by monitoring equipment, his normally ruddy complexion pale against the white sheets. A nasal cannula delivered oxygen, and IV lines snaked from both arms. Martha moved to Earl's side immediately, taking his hand and speaking softly to him, though his eyes remained closed. Brian hung back, his clinical gaze assessing his father's condition, the steady rhythm of the cardiac monitor, the clear fluid in the IV bags, the clean dressing visible at the edge of the hospital gown where it covered Earl's back. A movement at the door caught Brian's attention. Dr. Thompson had returned, carrying a specimen container. Inside, preserved in clear fluid, was the parasite they had removed from Earl's back, a pale segmented worm approximately 4 inches long with a distinctive head. "I thought you might want to see what we extracted," she said quietly. "It's a fascinating specimen, fully mature, gonethostoma, probably been growing for about a week based on its size." Brian took the container, studying the parasite with professional interest that barely masked his personal revulsion. This thing had been inside his father, feeding on him, causing the infection that had nearly killed him. "Have you seen cases like this before?" he asked. Dr. Thompson shook her head. "Only in textbooks. We've consulted with the CDC since this is such a rare case in the United States. They're interested in tracing the origin, particularly if it came from a hiker who might unknowingly be spreading it." "Dad mentioned the hiker had been in Southeast Asia and South America," Brian said. "Name was David something Carson, I think." "We'll follow up with the local authorities," Dr. Thompson replied. "If this hiker is still infected and doesn't know it, he could be in danger himself." Brian nodded, his gaze returning to the parasite in the container. The reality of how close they had come to losing Earl hit him anew. If Martha hadn't found that journal, if she hadn't called Brian, if they hadn't gotten Earl to the hospital when they did, your father was lucky, Thompson said, seeming to read his thoughts. This parasite was attempting to migrate deeper into the tissue. Given another day or two, it could have reached a major blood vessel, or even begun affecting the spinal cord. Brian swallowed hard, handing the specimen container back to Dr. Thompson. Thank you for everything. She nodded and departed, leaving Brian to join Martha at Earl's bedside. His mother looked up as he approached, her eyes red-rimmed, but dry. He seems so small, she whispered. I've never thought of your father as small before. Brian understood what she meant. Earl Whitaker had always been larger than life, a Vietnam veteran, a Montana rancher who could break horses and mend fences and work from sunrise to sunset without complaint. Seeing him diminished by illness, dependent on machines and medicines, was jarring. He's going to hate this when he wakes up, Brian said with a slight smile. All these tubes and monitors, the hospital smell. Maybe, Martha replied, stroking Earl's hand. Or maybe this will be the thing that finally helps him face those old ghosts. They stayed until the nurse gently informed them that visiting time was over, promising to call immediately if there was any change in Earl's condition. As they walked to the parking lot where Brian's car waited, the early morning sun was just beginning to lighten the eastern sky. You should get some rest, Brian told his mother as he opened the passenger door for her. Dad's in good hands. I can bring you back this afternoon. Martha nodded, too exhausted to argue. As they drove through the quiet streets of the small Montana town toward the Whitaker farm, Brian's phone rang. He answered it through the car's Bluetooth system. Dr. Whitaker speaking. Dr. Whitaker, this is Dr. Reynolds from the CDC. Dr. Thompson shared your father's case with us. I understand he might have contracted nathostomiasis from an infected hiker. That's our best guess, Brian confirmed. A man named David Carson, who'd been traveling in Southeast Asia in South America. We've been tracking several cases of nathostomiasis across the western United States over the past month. Dr. Reynolds explained, all connected to a tour group that visited Thailand and then Peru. One of the members was a David Carson from Seattle. Brian exchanged a surprised look with Martha. That can't be a coincidence. It's not, Dr. Reynolds confirmed. Mr. Carson was hospitalized in Seattle 3 days ago with advanced nathostomiasis. During contact tracing, he mentioned helping a local man with boat repairs while hiking in Montana, but couldn't recall the man's name. That would be my father, Brian said. He helped Carson after he injured his arm. This confirms our transmission theory, Dr. Reynolds said, professional satisfaction evident in his voice. Mr. Carson had multiple parasites, some of which were emerging when he was admitted. He likely had open lesions during his hike in Montana, creating the opportunity for cross-infection. Is he all right? Martha asked. Concern for the stranger evident despite everything? He's responding well to treatment, Dr. Reynolds assured them. We've been able to identify and contact most of the tour group. Your father's case is helping us understand the transmission patterns of this parasite outside its normal geographical range. After the call ended, Brian and Martha drove in silence for several minutes, absorbing this new information. Your father helped that man, Martha finally said. Even though it nearly killed him, I know he wouldn't regret it. Brian nodded, knowing she was right. For all his gruffness, Earl Whitaker had never been able to turn away from someone in need, a quality that had made him an effective medic in Vietnam and had nearly cost him his life on a peaceful fishing trip 50 years later. As they pulled into the driveway of the farmhouse, dawn was breaking fully over the eastern mountains. Brian helped his exhausted mother inside, settling her on the couch where Earl had lain in agony just hours before. I'm going to get a few hours of sleep, then head back to the hospital, he told her, covering her with a blanket. You rest as long as you need to. Martha caught his hand before he could move away. I want you to take this, she said, reaching for Earl's journal on the side table. Read it. I think you need to understand your father better. And I think when he wakes up, you two need to talk. Really talk for maybe the first time. While Brian took the worn leather journal, feeling the weight of its contents beyond the physical heft of the book itself. I will, he promised. Get some rest, Mom. In the guest bedroom, Brian sat on the edge of the bed, turning the journal over in his hands. Finally, he opened it to the first page and began to read. Discovering the father he had never fully known, the young man with dreams of becoming a doctor, the combat medic haunted by those he couldn't save, the returning veteran who buried his ambitions alongside his trauma. By the time he finished reading the final entry, tears streaked Brian's face. He understood now not just Earl's aversion to hospitals and doctors, but the complicated pride and fear with which Earl had watched Brian pursue the very career he had abandoned. "We're going to talk about all of this, Dad," Brian whispered to the empty room. "As soon as you're well enough, no more secrets. No more carrying these burdens alone." 1 month after his emergency surgery, Earl Whitaker stood on the bank of the Blackfoot River, fishing rod in hand, watching the early morning sun sparkle on the water. The spot was just downstream from where he'd helped David Carson, the hiker whose parasitic hitchhiker had nearly cost Earl his life. The irony wasn't lost on him. "You sure you're up for this?" Frank Miller asked, adjusting his worn fishing hat. "Martha said you're still supposed to be taking it easy." Earl cast his line with practiced precision, the movement pulling slightly at the healing wound on his back. "Doctor cleared me for light activity," he said. "Besides, can't let a little worm keep me off the river forever." Frank chuckled, though his eyes held a trace of the worry that had been there since Earl's hospitalization. "Little worm, my foot. Brian showed me the pictures. Damn thing looked like something out of a horror movie." "Just a parasite," Earl replied with a shrug that belied the weeks of recovery behind him. Nothing special about it except being in the wrong place at the wrong time. They fished in companionable silence for a while, the familiar rhythm of cast and retrieve as soothing to Earl as any meditation. The hospital stay and subsequent weeks of recovery had given him too much time to think, to remember, to face ghosts he'd spent decades avoiding. "Martha tells me you've been seeing someone," Frank said casually, reeling in his line to check his bait. "A therapist," Earl confirmed, the admission still feeling strange on his tongue. "Va connected me with someone who specializes in Vietnam vets, PTSD and all that." Frank nodded, his expression carefully neutral. They'd served in different units, had different experiences in Vietnam, but both carried scars that went deeper than skin. "Helping any?" Frank asked. Earl considered the question seriously. "Some," he admitted. "Talking about Sullivan, about the things that's over there, doesn't change what happened, but maybe changes how I carry it." "Good," Frank said simply. "About damn time." Earl smiled slightly at his friend's bluntness. "Yeah, well, sometimes it takes a parasitic worm eating your back to make you reevaluate your life choices." The joke fell flat, both men too aware of how close Earl had come to not making it back from the hospital. They returned to fishing, the conversation shifting to safer topics: Frank's new granddaughter, the price of cattle feed, the town council's endless debate about repairing the bridge over Clearwater Creek. When the sun rose high enough to chase away the morning chill, they packed up their gear. Earl had caught 2 decent-sized trout, less than his usual haul, but enough to feel like the day had been productive. "Martha, expecting you back for lunch?" Frank asked as they loaded their tackle into Earl's truck. Earl nodded. "Brian and Andrea are bringing the kids out to the farm, some kind of family lunch thing Martha's been planning all week." "Sounds nice," Frank said. "Give them my best." As Earl drove the familiar roads back to the farmhouse, he found himself rehearsing what he wanted to say to Brian. The hospital stay had broken down walls between them, but there was still so much unsaid, so many years of distance to bridge. Martha was waiting on the porch when he pulled up, her face lightening with a smile that still made his heart skip after all these years. "Catch anything?" she called as he climbed carefully from the truck. Earl held up his modest catch. "Couple of nice ones. Not my best day, but not my worst either." Martha descended the porch steps to meet him, her keen eyes assessing his movements, looking for signs of pain or fatigue. The protective scrutiny that once would have irritated him now felt like a comfort. "You're just in time," she said, taking the fish from him. Brian called, "They'll be here in 20 minutes." Inside, the farmhouse smelled of Martha's cooking pot roast and fresh bread, apple pie cooling on the windowsill. Earl washed up, changing his shirt and carefully checking the healing wound on his back in the bathroom mirror. The scar was still angry and red, a jagged line where the surgeons had cut to remove the parasite and clean out the infected tissue. "Ain't pretty," he muttered to his reflection, "but better than the alternative." The sound of tires on gravel announced Brian's arrival. Earl watched from the window as his son helped Andrea out of the car, then unbuckled the kids from their car seats. 10-year-old James's name for Earl's father sprinted toward the house immediately, while 7-year-old Lily followed more sedately, clutching a drawing she'd presumably made for her grandparents. Earl met them at the door, bracing himself as James launched into a hug that tested his still healing back. "Easy there, partner," Brian cautioned, placing a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. "Remember what we talked about Grandpa still getting better?" James stepped back, suddenly serious. "Sorry, Grandpa. Did I hurt you?" Earl ruffled the boy's hair. "Takes more than a tackle from a squirt like you to put me down." Lily approached next, holding out her drawing, a colorful rendering of what appeared to be Earl fishing, complete with a disproportionately large fish on his line. "It's you catching fish, Grandpa," she explained unnecessarily. "Mom says you're going fishing again, so I drew you catching the biggest one ever. It's perfect," Earl said, genuinely touched. "We'll hang it right on the refrigerator where everyone can see it." Martha emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, and the usual flurry of greetings and hugs ensued. The kids were dispatched to wash up for lunch, and Andrea followed Martha to help with final preparations, leaving Earl and Brian alone in the living room. "How's the back feeling?" Brian asked, slipping briefly into doctor mode. "Healing," Earl replied. "Still pulls when I move certain ways, but getting better every day," Brian nodded, satisfied. The follow-up cultures were clean, no sign of residual infection, and awkward silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken words. Earl cleared his throat. "Been meaning to talk to you," he began, "about what your mother found. The journal, medical school." Brian met his father's gaze steadily. "I read it," he admitted. "All of it." "Mom thought I should," Earl nodded, not surprised. "Figured as much. Explains a few things, I suppose." "It explains a lot," Brian said quietly. "Why you were so distant when I decided to become a doctor, why you never talked about Vietnam, why you avoided hospitals like they were radioactive." Wash. Earl moved to the window, looking out at the Montana landscape that had been his refuge after the war. "Never wanted you to think I wasn't proud of you," he said finally. "Because I was, and always have been." "I know that now," Brian replied. "But for a long time I thought you were disappointed I didn't want to take over the ranch, that I chose medicine instead of following in your footsteps." Earl turned back to face his son, a sad smile touching his lips. "Turns out you were following in my footsteps after all, just not the ones anyone could see." "Why didn't you try again?" Brian asked. "After Vietnam, you could have reapplied to medical school." Earl shook his head. "Couldn't walk into a hospital without hearing the choppers, without seeing Sullivan's face, the others, all the ones I couldn't save." He paused. "The admission's still difficult after all these years. Was afraid I'd freeze up when it mattered, that more people would die because I wasn't good enough." "Dad," Brian began, but Earl held up a hand. "Let me finish. Been keeping this bottled up for 50 years. Earl took a deep breath. "What I'm trying to say is, watching you become the doctor I couldn't be. It's been one of the greatest joys of my life, and one of the hardest things too, because it reminded me of what I gave up, what I was too scared to try again." Brian crossed the room, placing a hand on his father's shoulder. "It's never too late, you know, not to become a doctor maybe, but to use what you know. The VA needs volunteers with medical experience, or the free clinic in town." Earl nodded slowly. "Been thinking about that. Actually, therapists suggested something similar, said it might be healing." "Lunch is ready," Martha called from the dining room, breaking the moment. "We'll talk more later," Brian promised as they moved to join the others. The meal was lively, with James chattering about his baseball team and Lily describing her art class in meticulous detail. Earl watched his family, Martha, still beautiful to him after all these years. Brian, the son who had fulfilled the dream Earl had abandoned. Andrea, who had supported Brian through the grueling years of medical school and residency. And the grandchildren, bright and untouched by the shadows that had haunted their grandfather for decades. "Everything okay?" Martha asked quietly. Noticing his contemplative expression, Earl nodded, covering her hand with his. "Just counting my blessings." After lunch, while Martha and Andrea took the kids to see the new calves in the barn, Earl and Brian sat on the porch, the conversation returning to what had been started before lunch. "I've been thinking," Earl said, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead, "about what you said, volunteering." And Brian prompted, "Called the VA clinic yesterday. They need someone to help with intake a couple days a week. Nothing fancy, just taking vitals, basic medical history. Said my combat medic trainings was more than enough." Brian's face broke into a genuine smile. "That's great. Dad, really great." "Might be nothing," Earl cautioned. "Might find I still can't handle it. Or you might find it's exactly what you've needed all these years." Brian countered. "Either way you're trying, that's what matters." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the afternoon sun warm on their faces. Finally, when Earl spoke again, "Sometimes the hardest thing for a man to do is admit when he needs help," he said, the words coming easier than he'd expected. "Took a damn worm in my back to teach me that lesson." Brian chuckled. "Better late than never." "That's what your mother said," Earl replied with a smile. As the day wound down and Brian's family prepared to leave, Earl found himself standing once more at the edge of the property, looking out over the land that had been his sanctuary and in some ways his prison these past 50 years. Martha joined him, slipping her hand into his. "Penny, for your thoughts." "Just thinking about second chances," Earl replied, "and how sometimes they come in the strangest packages." "Like parasitic worms?" Martha asked with a raised eyebrow. Earl laughed, the sound free and genuine, exactly like parasitic worms. As they walked back to the house, arm in arm, Earl glanced at the tackle box in the bed of his truck. Nestled beside his fishing gear was a new addition, a fully stocked first aid kit, complete with sterile gloves. Some lessons, Earl reflected, took a lifetime to learn, and sometimes the most important healing had nothing to do with medicine at all. Earl Whitaker's journey reminds us that it's never too late to confront the ghosts of our past. For many of us who grew up in a generation where strength meant silence and vulnerability was weakness, we've buried our deepest wounds beneath layers of stoicism and self-reliance. Like Earl, we may have convinced ourselves that pain, whether physical or emotional, is something to endure rather than address. Perhaps we too have dreams we abandoned, traumas we've hidden, or relationships strained by our inability to ask for help. But Earl's story shows us that true courage isn't found in suffering alone. It's in having the strength to open up, to seek help, to reconnect with loved ones we've kept at arm's length. The parasitic worm that nearly took Earl's life ultimately gave him something precious, a second chance to heal old wounds, reconcile with his son, and find purpose in sharing his long-hidden talents. Our bodies may bear the scars of time, but our spirits are capable of remarkable renewal. It's not weakness to acknowledge pain or seek assistance, it's wisdom. And sometimes the healing we've denied ourselves for decades can begin with a single conversation, a simple admission, "I need help."